Welcome to the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare module, Navigating the System, Addressing the Overrepresentation of Parents with Disabilities in CPS. This module was developed by Drs. Tracy Lalaberty and Christine Peischer, Nicole Mickelson, and Jordan St. Charles, with narration by Dunya Dadi. The module complements the material presented in a multi-module series created by Dr. Elizabeth Lightfoot, which can also be found on the CASHU website. We encourage learners to complete all modules to enhance their knowledge and abilities to interact with families headed by parents with a disability. Additional resources for working with parents can be found on the Disability Child Welfare Collaborative page within the CASHU website, including contact information for Drs. Lalaberty and Lightfoot, experts in this field.
Individuals with disabilities face numerous barriers to creating and maintaining families. These barriers are rooted in social stereotypes and prejudicial assumptions about limited parenting abilities. It is often assumed that parents with disabilities will maltreat their children or risk their children's safety. Historically, service workers and professionals have expressed concerns about individuals with disabilities marrying and raising children, but have also been supportive of parents with disabilities raising children when appropriate supports and services can be put into place. In addition to discrimination and prejudice in maintaining and creating families, parents with disabilities face a number of challenges and stressors which may undermine parenting ability, including poverty, unemployment, social isolation, and inadequate support, and substance abuse across disability types. Despite these challenges, parents with disabilities tend to hesitate seeking services or assistance because of fear of losing their children, which is a reality for many. Child protection systems are often not equipped to work effectively with parents with disabilities, regardless of the disability type. Comprehensive and initial assessments allow caseworkers to have a better understanding of the skills and capabilities of parents, as well as to link their needs to appropriate services and supports. For example, structural decision-making, SDM, as a risk assessment was developed to assist professionals' decision-making at all points in a CPS case and has been implemented in 22 states. However, it tends to focus on deficiencies within families rather than exploring the family's strengths and available informal resources, in addition to overestimating the risk as well as oversimplifying situations by not dealing with the complexity of real life. Additional policies use disability labels to inform decision-making, for example, termination of parental rights, TPR. Statutes in 37 states include disability language as grounds for TPR in 2010, which implies parents with disabilities may be at a disadvantage in court proceedings. Given that the TPR statutes provide a guideline for the workers in the CPS system, this law may partly encourage CPS workers to consider a disability label rather than the parenting ability of parents with disability in their decision-making process. Despite recent efforts to increase workforce capacity for working with parents with disabilities, service delivery in CPS often does not consider the context of the lives of parents with disabilities and their complex needs. Complexities without corresponding context or protective factors may accumulate risk points in assessments for parents with disabilities. Often services delivered to parents with disabilities are mismatched between the parents and professional perception of family needs. For example, social service workers overestimated in some areas of services, such as childcare, training for parents with intellectual disabilities and underestimated in other areas such as housing needs or vocational training. As with other populations who experience prejudice and discrimination, such as families of color and families of poverty, parents with disabilities are often disproportionately involved in the child protection system. This is true for parents who live with a variety of disabilities, including intellectual and/or developmental disabilities, or IDD, sensory disabilities, and severe mental illness. However, research from the United States has been limited in determining the extent and disproportionate involvement in CPS for parents with disabilities. Much of the existing research has an international focus, specifically Australia, and focuses on parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities. High rates of removal of children from parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities have been demonstrated through numerous studies. The removal rates for cases involving a parent with intellectual and developmental disabilities range from 33% to 45%. Similarly, mothers with serious mental illness were 2.8 times more likely to have their children in out-of-home placement than parents without a serious mental illness. While the system may not currently work appropriately with parents with disability before system-level intervention can be created, we need a better understanding of where the disparity began, where it exists, and from whom. This requires a fundamental assessment of disparity throughout CPS decision-making points for parents with different types of disability. Based on the available literature, we know that parents with disabilities face a variety of challenges with regards to parenting, and parents with disabilities are disproportionately involved in the child protection system. We know less about the precise estimates of involvement in CPS for people with different types of disabilities at multiple CPS decision-making points, particularly at the state or local level. In Minnesota, the proportion of parents with disabilities in CPS is mostly unknown. In order to improve service provision, we need to understand the population we are serving and where gaps exist. The current study mainly aims to fill the knowledge gap by estimating the representation of parents with disabilities at CPS decision-making point based on disability diagnosis. Using administrative data from the Minnesota Linking Information for Kids project, the current study sought to understand the characteristics, experiences, and representation of parents with disabilities in the child protection system as compared to parents without disabilities. The characteristics of parents with disabilities in the sample showed that parents were predominantly male, white, and experienced poverty in childhood. Parents with disabilities who were involved in CPS in Minnesota were predominantly female, white, but to a lesser extent than the sample as a whole, and experienced poverty in childhood, but to a greater extent than the whole sample. Of the 303,039 individuals in the full sample, fewer than 1%, or 2,081, were involved in a CPS investigation between 2000 and 2012. Of those parents who were involved in a CPS investigation, 53%, or 1,101, went on to have at least one of their children placed out of home, and of those 28%, or 308, experienced a termination of parental rights of at least one of their children. The full sample was comprised of nearly equal numbers of males and females, and a majority of the sample was white. Nearly 1/4 of the parents in the sample had a history of living in impoverished circumstances, which was measured by having received free or reduced price lunch in childhood. Characteristics of parents generally resemble those of the full sample, with a couple of exceptions. First, a higher proportion of individuals with disabilities across all 6 categories were male than in the full sample. And second, a higher proportion of parents with some disabilities, such as IDD, specific learning disabilities, EBD, and sensory disabilities, came from impoverished backgrounds than in the full sample. However, the characteristics of the 2,081 parents who were alleged offenders of child maltreatment in a CPS investigation were quite different than those of the larger population. The majority of parents involved in CPS were female and white, but to a lesser extent, and a disproportionately large number of parents in CPS cases came from impoverished backgrounds. The average age of a parent at the time of the first CPS investigation was 23.4 years old. Of the parents with disabilities in CPS involved, characteristics were mostly similar, except they were as likely or more likely to have experienced poverty in childhood. A total of 1,101 parents experienced the out-of-home placement of at least one child. These parents tended to be female and white, similar to the full CPS sample. However, the proportion of American Indian, Alaska Native parents, and parents coming from impoverished backgrounds were slightly higher than that of the CPS sample. Mean parental age at the time of out-of-home placement was 23.2 years old. Some parents with disabilities, namely IDD, sensory, and/or other disabilities, were slightly older at the time of out-of-home placement. Other characteristics of parents with disabilities were representative of parents in the CPS sample, but slightly increased in disproportionality with regards to gender, race, and poverty. 308 parents in the sample experienced the termination of parental rights of at least one child during the study's timeframe. Parent characteristics were mostly similar to those of parents who experienced out-of-home placement, but a smaller proportion of parents were Black and a larger proportion were white. Average parent age at the time of termination of parental rights was 24.2 years old. Parents with disabilities were similar to those of the general out-of-home placement sample, except the proportion of American Indian, Alaska Native parents decreased and the proportion of white parents increased. In addition to describing the characteristics and experiences of parents, this study sought to determine whether or not parents with disabilities are overrepresented in CPS in Minnesota. And if those disparities exist, does the overrepresentation remain throughout out-of-home placement and the termination of parental rights? The disparity indices used to calculate the overrepresentation of parents with disabilities showed that overall, the presence of a disability were disproportionately represented in CPS investigations. Parents were 2.71 times more likely to experience a CPS investigation than individuals without disabilities. Specific disability categories contribute to the disproportionality in different ways and had different trajectories of disproportionality at different CPS points. Parents with disabilities, regardless of type, were 2.71 times more likely to be the alleged offender in a CPS investigation than parents without a history of disability diagnosis. When looking at disproportionality among each of the 6 disability categories, the largest disproportionality existed among parents with an emotional behavioral disorder, who were 5.1 times more likely to experience a CPS investigation compared to those without a disability. Parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities, or IDD, were 2.31 times more likely. Specific learning disabilities were 2.16 times more likely, and sensory disabilities were 1.43 times more likely to experience a CPS investigation than parents without disabilities. Parents with other types of disabilities were nearly as likely to experience an investigation, and parents with a 504 accommodation were less likely to experience an investigation. As some parents progress through CPS into out of home placement, parents with different disabilities experience different trajectories in their likelihood of experiencing the occurrence. The presence of any disability indicated only a small disproportionality of 1.07 times more likely to experience the out of home placement of one child compared to individuals without disability. Parents with a 504 accommodation and other disabilities experience an increase in disproportionality to 1.37 times and 1.21 times more likely to experience out of home placement, respectively. Parents with IDD, EBD, and specific learning disabilities all experience disproportionate out of home placement to a lesser extent. 1.17 times more likely, 1.07 times more likely, and 1.07 times more likely, respectively. Parents with sensory disabilities were less likely to experience an out-of-home placement than parents with disabilities. With the exception of parents with 504 accommodations, all parents with disabilities experience an increase in likelihood of experiencing termination of parental rights, or TPR, as compared to parents without disabilities. Overall, parents with any disability were 1.55 times more likely to experience TPR. Parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities were 2.18 times more likely to experience TPR. Parents with emotional behavioral disorders were 1.65 times more likely. Parents with other disabilities and specific learning disabilities were 1.36 and 1.29 times more likely, respectively, to experience termination of parental rights. Parents with sensory disabilities were nearly as likely as parents without disabilities to experience termination of parental rights, and parents with a 504 accommodation were less likely to experience termination of parental rights than parents without disabilities. Because disparity indices do not account for other risk factors that are often associated with CPS involvement, logistic regression was also used to determine whether the presence of a disability diagnosis was a significant predictor of progression through the CPS system. Childhood poverty, gender, and race are characteristics commonly associated with disproportionate CPS involvement and were used to adjust for risk in the logistic regression. When disability label, poverty, gender, and race were considered together in assessing CPS progression for parents with a disability as compared to their non-disabled peers, the variable significantly predicted involvement in a CPS investigation, experiencing an out-of-home placement, and experiencing a termination of parental rights. The odds of parents being involved in investigation were 2.43 times higher than those without a disability, 1.24 times higher odds of experience out-of-home placement, and 1.85 times higher odds of experiencing a termination of parental rights. When individual disability labels were considered to significantly predict involvement in CPS or lack thereof, the odds of being involved in an investigation were greatest for parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities, specific learning disabilities, and emotional behavioral disorders. The odds of being involved in an investigation for parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities, specific learning disabilities, and emotional behavior disorders were 1.72 times, 1.95 times, and 1.44 times higher, respectively, than parents without disabilities. While parents with sensory and other disabilities were more likely and 504 accommodation less likely to be involved in an investigation, they lacked statistical significance. As with the disparity indices, there were distinct progressions into CPS depending on the identified disability. When adjusting for risk, the odds of experiencing out-of-home placement were insignificant for all 6 disability labels. Parents with sensory disabilities were the only ones to experience lower odds of out-of-home placement compared to parents without disabilities. Significant predictors of experiencing TPR included the presence of an intellectual and developmental disability and emotional behavioral disorder. Parents with a history of these disabilities were 3.5 times and 2.02 times more likely to experience termination of parental rights compared to parents without disabilities. Overall, this study found that parents with disabilities were 2.71 times more likely to be involved in a CPS investigation than parents without a history of disability diagnosis. Parents with disabilities were 1.07 times more likely to experience the out-of-home placement of at least one child than parents without a disability. And parents with disabilities were 1.55 times more likely to experience a termination of parental rights of that child than parents without a disability. However, the rates of involvement of parents with disabilities changed throughout key decision-making points in the child protection system, and involvement looked different for parents depending on the disability label. Parents with disabilities became increasingly overrepresented throughout the child protection process, even when controlling for race, ethnicity, gender, and economic status. Parents with disabilities are often the best teachers for how professionals in the field of child protection can deliver effective services. A number of studies are available which utilize parental voices to teach us. Resources on the CASHU website can direct you to those studies. For this module, we felt it was also important for you to hear from professionals who have worked for many years in the field of child protection with parents with disabilities. Their insights may help you to think about your own practice and ways you might be able to improve your work in partnership with parents. You may want to have a paper and pencil ready to take notes or write comments to yourself to reflect on later in this module. Topics you will hear about over the next several slides include workforce and training, service provision, including housing, parenting, and resources, screening and assessment, policy and systemic barriers, and bias and discrimination. As you move through the following slides, hear about their experiences and working with parents with disabilities. Because disparity begins during the CPS process, disparity is presumably about systems factors such as lack of services, bias, and prejudice. On this slide, you will hear about bias and discrimination. While listening to these interviews, ask yourself ways in which bias exists in your work. Do their experiences resonate with you? Are you able to better identify times when you've experienced this in your work?
I would say that folks with disabilities have an additional barrier. It's the disability in and of itself, and the way that I think our large society has been socialized to ignore folks who are disabled, to make them be invisible, or to patronize, or to really not recognize the full capacity that they have to be contributing members to our society. So I think that that stigma in itself is very huge, and it's very difficult for people to work past. Pretty much in all of the professions that touch child welfare, there is that particular piece, or there is that expectation, whether it's spoken or realized or not. But it's there, and I know that I've had many painful conversations with clients who remind me of that each and every time, that I don't have any idea what it's like to be in their shoes.
So I think that all people come with bias, and professionals certainly come with bias. And the onus on us as professionals is to moderate our bias or our prejudice. And one area where maybe it's more acceptable or less visible is when people make judgments or hold bias against people who have disabilities. I think that in our society and community, people with disabilities didn't have children or weren't allowed to have children for a variety of reasons across a number of decades. And because of that, people, they don't know how to envision what parenting with disabilities looks like. They don't know how it can be successful. They don't know what it takes to support a parent with a disability in successfully parenting their child, and the fear of what might happen to the child, or what the risks might be, or what the safety issues could result in, lends people in a very litigious field toward making very conservative decisions and removing children from families headed by a parent with a disability, when in reality, the disability really doesn't play a part. It might be other issues such as lack of housing, substance abuse, domestic violence, unemployment, underemployment, the exact same issues that other families face who don't have a disability. But workers focus on that disability because it's concrete. It's something that they can attach a reason to, and often kids are split from their families because of that.
I think you have to go into it knowing that there are going to be some obstacles and there are going to be some barriers, but I think the kind of basis of our profession in social work is to meet our clients where they're at. And so trying to figure that out from the beginning is a little bit difficult because it's somebody new that you don't know, and you don't know what the struggles might be that they have and that they're facing. But trying to flush that out in interviews with them and meeting with them and meeting with providers, so that you can kind of see what the best way is to be able to work with them, and how you meet them where they're at and be able to support them through the strengths that they do have, despite whatever disability they might be working with.
I think with the population that I worked with, they absolutely love and adore their child. And when they come into the system, almost always it was neglect. And the neglect was always, depending on who was doing the report, depending on who was writing the report, it wasn't couched in the sense of a lack of knowledge. Yet that's what it almost always was. It was a lack of knowledge, a lack of understanding that led to the neglect. And what I found with this population is an eagerness to learn.
Parental support needs often go unnoticed or unaddressed in the absence of a screening mechanism. On this screen, you will hear more about screening and identification of disabilities. What procedures or tools does your agency use to help identify parents with disabilities in order to better support those families?
Most of what I work with is undiagnosed, and it usually is related to mental capacity and mental illness. So I certainly see some clients that I would view as being low functioning, but maybe have never been intellectually assessed or diagnosed that way. Which I think also, when it's undiagnosed, it just presents its own sets of challenges. I think if you have at least a diagnosis, you kind of know what to expect, or at least where to start, some of the basics that you might be running into with a client. So I think a lot of what we need to do is make sure that people are accurately diagnosed and know what it is that they're dealing with.
When I was a worker, I encountered a lot of parents who had disabilities on my caseload. But as I learned over time, they were really often invisible disabilities, sometimes disabilities that parents didn't claim or that we didn't recognize as a disability early on in the case. And it often led to a lot of confusion around what the parent could do versus what the parent was willing to do. And unfortunately, in social services, often parents get labeled with things such as uncooperative, belligerent, noncompliance, when I think that I learned over time a lot of those negative attributes weren't motivated by intent on the parent, but often it was an issue of confusion or not understanding the instructions or where they needed to be or what they needed to do. So working with parents with disabilities differently became very evident to me as a worker, and trying to help educate my coworkers or my supervisors to understand that is challenging. It sometimes created conflict or disagreement in the direction of a case or what outcomes might be favorable for a family. And I found that there was often very little training that workers could get to help them to know what to do as they worked with families with disabilities. I think one of the most significant things that workers have to keep in mind and supervisors have to keep in mind is every parent with a disability is unique, because every disability is unique, and we use labels and diagnoses so that we can commonly talk about things that are likely associated or may be associated with a certain type of disability or a limitation in ability. But the reality is, research has shown in the vast majority of cases, until you get to a very low number, for instance, you can't use IQ to predict parenting ability. You have to do an assessment of what a person's actual ability is. And we have to do those assessments differently than we do with a parent who might not have an intellectual disability. We can't do abstract questioning. You can't do an assessment in a doctor's office with 4 walls, 19 blocks from where they live. You must do the assessment in the person's home so that they can show you what they can do rather than tell you. We don't want to assess people's communication skill and how well they can tell you about their parenting. We want to know about their actual parenting. And this is a particular group of people who need an assessment that's done differently. And whether agencies are willing to pay the money for that, whether jurisdictions have people who are trained and prepared to do that, remains a challenge in many, many places.
Next, you'll hear about policy and systemic barriers. Systemic barriers are still prevalent, and we may not be aware of them in our practice. After listening to the clips, take a moment to write down any policies in your jurisdiction that put parents with disabilities at a disadvantage in the child protection system. What are systemic barriers in your practice that put parents with disabilities at a disadvantage? Are there steps you can take to dismantle these barriers? As you listen to the next set of clips on successful service provision, continue to think about these systemic barriers and ways they can be dismantled in your practice.
In my current job, I do research and I focus very specifically on parents with intellectual and developmental disabilities who are in child welfare. And recently there was a case in Massachusetts where an infant was removed from the mom in the hospital, and the sole allegation was that mom had an intellectual disability. There wasn't necessarily a concern that she had harmed the baby or that she couldn't necessarily attend to the baby, but it was that inherent bias of we don't know what's going to happen and we're nervous and it seems like she can't do it, and they called child protection. Child protection removed the child from the hospital. Immediately at that point in time, mom was living with grandparents, had stable housing, had supported services, and yet that removal happened. And for 2 years, that child remained in foster care, and mom fought. She worked her case plan, did everything she was supposed to do, but fought hard to get that baby back, and they were moving to permanency, again, really for no allegation against safety at all. And mom on her own found somehow the unit of civil rights at the U.S. Health and Human Service Department and got somebody interested in her case. They came out, they investigated, and indeed they found that the state of Massachusetts had violated her civil rights, opened a case, brought it back into court, and ordered the return of that 2-year-old to her mother and awarded her civil damages for what had been endured. And that has never happened. So there's a turning of the tide, so to speak, in terms of a recognition that people with disabilities can parent, that it might look different, that they might need things done differently, and that we might need to come up with more appropriate assessments to truly know what people can and cannot do. And that together, the Civil Rights Division of HHS and the Administration for Children and Families put out a memo to all child welfare agencies across the country that said, in fact, you may not remove children based on a parent's disability, and that you must do an appropriate assessment that is appropriate to that parent's abilities. Now, I don't think that's happening necessarily across the country, but it is remarkable within our policy realm that that memo exists, that it was sent out, and that agencies are starting to recognize, oh, we have to do this differently. And they're asking for help. They're asking for assessment tools.
I think trust and establishing that as the clinical person who's working with them is essential to work through many of those difficult times that are going to happen, because you're going to have difficult times when you're in child protection and somebody is looking at you. You've got guardian ad litems that are looking at you. You've got judges, you've got attorneys, and everybody has an opinion about what you're able to do and what you're not able to do. And they're all focused on what you're not able to do. And so having that trusting relationship with the professional who's working with you, who really does believe that you're capable of many things that a lot of others are not giving you credit for, is critical. Now, I'm not going to get to be able to work on that and establish the working relationship if we haven't first established a trusting relationship. I would say that some of the systemic barriers that I experienced were a lot of the workers and other professionals who were involved with the family that I was assigned to work with ran into many child protection workers who made the referral to our program because they were fulfilling an obligation rather than really having a belief that this person could perhaps learn and understand how to be a parent. You always, if it ended up in court, and many of the cases I worked with did end up in court, the concept of being in court is because somebody has decided this is serious enough that we need to begin to prepare for moving this child to some other kind of long-term arrangement. And so the notion that you may have a judge, almost always a county attorney, sometimes even the public defender, often the guardian ad litem, who didn't have faith that something could be different, created just another barrier to moving forward. Some of the other systemic stuff, and that maybe this fits in my definition of systemic, is the whole notion of day-to-day basic needs. We discovered very early on in our program, we would show up at the door to begin to work with somebody, and often they were sleeping on somebody's couch. Maybe it was a family member, maybe it wasn't. And next week they might be sleeping on somebody else's couch. So the system, these are all low-income people. They didn't have the ability to be housed in something that was their own. And if they did have that ability, they were often dealing with a slum landlord or some kind of landlord-tenant situation that was taking advantage of them. They were almost never in a safe neighborhood. And so I'd walk in the door as a parenting worker, and this is what child protection wants me to do. This is what the judge wants me to do. And they're not sure where they're going to be sleeping tonight. They're not sure what they're going to feed their kids because they used all their food stamps. They put it in the refrigerator of the family they're staying with, and everybody's eating it. And they're on day 10, and they got 20 more days until they get their food stamps again. So I saw a lot of that kind of systemic struggle in how am I going to survive day to day. And so we were fortunate enough to be able to work with the state of Minnesota to begin to provide some housing support and assistance.
I think in all of the work that we do in social work, we see the systemic barriers being obstacles for all of our clients. I do think that when you're working with an individual with a disability, it's just a little bit more acute and you see it a little bit more significantly. I think that's what my role as a social worker is to try and find ways to support them through the system. It might not be set up for them to be the most successful, and it might actually be working against them in a lot of situations. But I think that's part of what my role is, to help find the ways to guide them through that and be their support person to be successful, even though the system might not always be setting themselves up for success. Just as simple as trying to get to like court mandated appointments. I think, we take for granted that, for you or I, it might be just easy to hop in our car and get to a court hearing that, it's been ordered. The juvenile justice system is not necessarily set up to make people successful. I think that's what the intent is, but it doesn't always work that way. And then our clients with disabilities, it just presents an even more tremendous barrier for them, I think. It might not be easy for them to find transportation and get to a court hearing that's required of them. They might need more support in doing that. And I think, again, that's part of what my role is, to try and make sure that we find ways to help work around the the systems things that aren't working for them and aren't making it easy for them to get through the process that they have to get through.
This series of clips focus on successful service provision for parents with disabilities. You will hear practitioners discuss culturally competent services, family and community resources, and other unique service needs for these families. As you listen, do you find that their experiences were similar or different to your work? What are ways in which you have seen community and family support systems at work in your practice? Can you identify a time when you needed to determine whether a parent had the support network they needed to aid in parenting and to prevent CPS involvement?
So the services that are in the greatest need for the clients that I currently work with is definitely related to mental illness and mental health. I think there's a lot of services that are lacking, but I think the biggest need is access to reliable mental health services with providers that they feel a connection with and that are culturally appropriate. I think there's a therapist on every corner around Minneapolis, and it's not that they're not there, but I think it's difficult to help a client find an appropriate fit to receive their mental health services. And I don't think we've made enough progress on being able to provide enough of that for the clients and what they need. I work currently in Indian child welfare, so all of my clients are Native American. I work really hard to try and find them culturally appropriate services, especially when it comes to mental illness. I think that's they feel very vulnerable when they're going to discuss their mental health. And being able to find a provider that is culturally similar to them and at least is aware and understands their culture and their background and how that might impact their mental illness, and the trauma that they've been through, their history, and what that looks like for them currently is difficult. I think we need to find ways to be able to support our clients, and being able to find them providers that are similar to them and able to better understand where they're coming from. I think then we would see better results for our clients and getting through the issues that they're facing. Most of the clients that I work with, the parents specifically who have some sort of a disability, whether it's treated or untreated, diagnosed or undiagnosed, it's related to mental health. And so for them, I think it's about finding what works.
I remember working with a mother who had a mild intellectual disability. And when I received the case, I was instructed to remove the kids. And there were 4 kids, and mom was clearly overwhelmed. She was unemployed. She had a hard time following through with services. People felt that she was largely disengaged from the process of wanting to make improvements to help her kids. In reality, she had a mild intellectual disability. She had mental health challenges. She was depressed, never raised the shades in her house, rarely went out. There was some suspicion of substance abuse, which there really wasn't. It was really masked with mental illness at the time. And we provided her with intensive family preservation services, somebody who spent hours a week in the home with her, demonstrating parenting, allowing her to try things. You know, confusion where she might give an infant orange soda because it was 99 cents for a 2-liter bottle versus orange juice, which had, you know, nutrients in it. To her, she didn't understand the difference in that. And people told her to provide nutritious meals. And she said, I'm doing everything you're telling me. I'm so upset. I'm so frustrated. Why doesn't this work? because she also was trying to balance what she could afford. And so help really teasing that out. Why are you giving a young child orange soda? Well, to her, it was orange juice, and she was trying to figure that out and do exactly what we wanted her to do. In the end, her depression improved. Her kids were much happier. They improved in school and in their developmental milestones. And she was visibly a much happier person. She moved her housing, and in doing so, moved out of the jurisdiction that I worked in, and I had to transfer her case. And in doing that, we had a conversation, and I asked her what she thought what the difference was. And I thought she would talk about those services, and clearly they made a difference. But what she had said in the end was, you believed I could do it, and I believed you because you believed I could. She wasn't able to believe in herself. Too many people had told her she couldn't do it. But she believed me that I believed her. And that for her was at least the catalyst to being able to make the change and be able to then start to turn things around so she could believe in herself ultimately.
I think what is really critical in working with this population is helping them embrace the notion that they are going to need help, and that accepting help is not a weakness. Accepting help is a strength. And that whole notion that it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a bigger village to raise a child of a parent who has an intellectual disability. And so convincing the client, the consumer, and getting them to trust in the notion that you cannot do this alone. If you try to do this alone, child protection will continue to come visiting. So we need to figure out what you can do successfully, what you can learn to do successfully, and also try to figure out what are the things that are just going to be too hard of a concept to grasp. And then figuring out, are there natural supports? Natural supports are obviously preferred over institutional supports. And so I found natural supports often in family, friends, the faith community. The Boys and Girls Club, as an example, over on the north side, was supportive of older children. They're not taking infants, but I would get parents to get their older kids involved in after-school programs so that they could focus on what the baby's needs or the toddler's needs were, without having a 10, 11, 12-year-old kind of getting in the way or wanting attention, wanting and needing, appropriately needing, the supports of a parent too. So, and you know, when I talk about getting them to acknowledge, I mean, that the whole educational thing was one of the more easier concepts for them to understand, that, you know, I can't help my kid with reading because I can't read. I can't help them with math because I can add 2 + 2, but I really can't help them with. And so it's like, there's the perfect end to say, well, here's this program, after school program, where your child can go and they're gonna get help with their schooling. They're gonna get probably dinner and a snack before they come home, and they're gonna be involved in a supportive environment doing socially appropriate things. They're not gonna be hanging out on the street with other 10, 11-year-olds getting into who knows what. Working as a parenting educator, working one-on-one with parents who had intellectual disability. Generally, the program that I worked in, the parent had to have an IQ under 70. They had to have minor children. And my job was to in some cases, evaluate their parenting abilities and capacities, and in other cases, it was to actually provide ongoing education, support, and teach them how to be better parents. There's a particular person, when somebody asks me, there's one particular person who I think of often. She was a young mom, probably had an IQ around 65. Boyfriend probably had an IQ of 75. They turned up pregnant, and her developmental disability case manager asked me to start working with her to prepare her for childbirth and then ultimately parenting. She had her baby. Child protection was notified from the hospital. And so now I had child protection involved also. I continued to work with her. She fortunately had a very supportive social worker who was assigned her case. That social worker knew me and knew what I did, and I think had faith in me. And so the child was actually reunified with the mom pretty quickly. But there were lots of things put in place. She had a very supportive grandma, and grandma became the daycare provider. So her daughter was there about 10 hours a day. The consumer who I was working with worked in the nutrition field in nursing homes, kind of her capacity. She was the beverage clerk and set tables, and loved her job, loved the people she worked with. But she was reaching her capacity in terms of employability. Over the course of a few years, with grandma's help, me working with her one-on-one, always in her home, her child was always present, teaching her different skills, helping her recognize what she was able to do and what she wasn't able to do, and helping her to understand that asking for help is a strength, not a weakness. That's one of the things that I think is the biggest struggle in working with this population. They're afraid to ask for help because somebody's going to think that they're dumb, they're stupid, that it's a weakness, and it gives them reason to do something other with their children than allowing them to stay with the parents. So it was a difficult task with her because she was not somebody who wanted to acknowledge that there were things that she couldn't do. But over the course of time, she kind of grasped onto that concept. A lot of help from grandma. Grandma was a hard-nosed old German lady, and if you think of a old school German lady, she fit Grandma Bonnie fit that to the T, and she wouldn't hesitate to get into my consumer's face about things that she was not doing right, or things that Bryce is teaching you and you're not using what he's teaching you, or so that young gal is graduating from high school actually this year, and she has continued to be with mom. There was one very brief incident where child protection got involved again, and it was because the consumer had a second child. And ultimately, with the help of grandma and myself participating, this consumer decided to have her cousin take custody of her daughter. And she continues to have contact with that child, who probably is 6 or 7 years old now. So.
It's not been there very long. I have attended a few trainings in the last couple of years, and it seems that it is growing in terms of momentum. And I do know that for myself, having a person who lives in our home who is a family member who is intellectually disabled, who is 57 years old, and working with county entities to make sure that there are resources and that there are places and services that are set up for her. We recognize that's a very important piece. And so in our work with that particular county social worker, litigating and putting together the plan, looking at how to allocate the resources, looking at the day programming that they're involved in, PCA services, the whole 9 yards. It's really around looking at how we can provide the best quality of services for my particular relative. And in the 5 years that this relative has been with us and been in this state, we have seen a dramatic change in terms of her affect, her ability to connect, and to do things that we didn't think that she had the capacity to do. So it's just been amazing that when you have the right resources at the right time with the right people doing the right things, you see a benefit almost immediately.
I would say the other thing that became very important was understanding that family can play a really critical role if you have family that's a resource. A lot of people in this population don't have family support, or they have family that exploit them, take advantage of them. Fortunately for this young woman, she had a grandma who really wanted to see her granddaughter be successful at raising her baby.
Turn to child welfare over and over, because as children meet new developmental milestones or there's new challenges in child rearing, often those things kind of explode or families implode and they come back into the system. And these are families that are often on the radar, so to speak, of human services, and it's easy to refer them and to report them back. So I think the development of social support networks in families headed by a parent with a disability is critical. I'm not sure that child protection sees that as their job, but really good workers know it is a part of good social work, and they figure out how to fit that into the case plan.
I remember one particular case involving a family. I'm trying to think, there were probably about 5 children. We had become involved for like the second time in terms of our work with this family. Did some diagnostic work with mom. She did also have a lower IQ, but she also had an unusual disorder where she had very significant short-term memory delays. And so what we figured out was that doing the regular parenting classes with mom and some of the other services where we had case managers coming in and doing skills buildings just simply didn't work because mom would simply forget those particular things. So we worked with this particular family for a number of different years. At one point, I would say we probably had 13 or 14 different agencies with case managers that were working with either the kids or with mom on various issues. And I recognized that right away that was very overwhelming for the family. So we really started to look at who really needed to be at the table and who didn't. And so we whittled the numbers down. We made sure that we were all on the same page in terms of what needed to happen. And the final result for that particular family is that we weren't able to resolve the issues that kept kids from being safe in this particular home. But we were able to find relatives and folks that were connected with this family and not have to terminate parental rights. And we actually ended up in a situation where the ongoing care for the children was delegated to other relatives, but they were all still closely connected to this particular mom. So really nothing changed in terms of the relationships that mom had with children, but the ongoing care of those children until they reached the age of majority was actually doled out to the other members of the family. So we kept them in contact, we kept them connected, but we didn't have to impose very severe sanction of, because she just didn't have the ability to take care of those kids. So that's a story that sticks out for me. And this was probably, we worked with this family for about 2.5 years. So it was quite a haul in terms of that.
So I worked with foster youth, usually 13 or older, who had been in the foster care system for most of their life, if not several years. And so the parents that I was working with had their rights terminated already, but a lot of them just happened to be disabled. And one of the things that really struck me was just how kind of the individualism of our society really kind of peeks its head out, and you see that caseworkers are kind of expecting those parents to be the main support and main help for their child, when the family as a whole is perfectly capable of caring for that child in tandem with the parent. But in terms of child welfare, we don't care about the whole family. We're looking at the individual parent in terms of making decisions for that child.
One of the biggest challenges for me is the fact that there's a lack of housing. Trying to work with clients and build their strengths and get them access to services and get them to appointments, consistently is really difficult when they don't have housing. I think the large majority of the clients that I work with don't have reliable housing. And so, yes, finding a service and finding an appropriate provider and getting an appropriate diagnosis are all important. We need to do that. But long term, it's difficult to help them be successful long term if they don't have reliable housing and the stability that that brings.
I definitely think that the bias that people have against, or I shouldn't say against, about people with disabilities. I think it's a societal notion that somebody with a developmental disability is not capable of raising children, is not capable of managing money, is not capable of holding steady employment, and they're just going to be somebody who sucks off the system their whole lives. And I didn't find that experience. Certainly I had cases that were like that, but I would say the majority of the cases I worked with, yeah, it was important that they get their welfare dollars, but many of them worked. And they may have only worked 10 or 15 hours a week, but it was really important to them that they be out there working also, showing people that they had the capability. I do think that the bias also exists with where people would end up living. And so when I was working with the housing program, I could help them hand pick neighborhoods because we were dealing with market rate rents with community landlords. And so we weren't stuck to tough neighborhoods with slumlords. And because of that, there was probably a little less exploitation than if you were living in a tough neighborhood and everybody was trying to get by. And sometimes that meant I'm going to come over because I know you got your food stamps and there's some food in your refrigerator and there's none in mine. Or I know you just got your Social Security check and you cashed it, and I know you've got a few $100. I had several clients who were robbed, 3 or 4 days after they got their Social Security check, and it was almost always there was never a break-in. Robbed is not the correct term. The money disappeared. And when you say, well, who was here? It was friends and family who were the only visitors in the home. And they, they go to the grocery store and dig in their purse, and the $200 that was there yesterday isn't there anymore. So I do think some of that bias, it's not just societal, but I certainly ran into family members that were convinced that their brother, their sister, their daughter, their brother or son was not going to be successful. And with those kind of families, unlike Grandma Bonnie, who was convinced that her granddaughter was going to figure this out, it just was going to take time. A lot of families that you couldn't rely on to be part of the support system because they did not support the notion that their child or their sibling was going to be successful.
Workforce training is another critical tool to combat overrepresentation of parents with disabilities. Comprehensive, broad-based training is especially critical for front-end CPS. As you think back to systemic barriers parents with disabilities face in the child protection system, consider the next interviews where practitioners discuss the child protection workforce and training. Do you feel barriers can be partly overcome through a knowledgeable workforce? After listening to these clips, reflect on the trainings and other resources that exist in your agency. Are there trainings specific to working with parents with disabilities? Do you rely more on your coworkers to be resources for best practices and effective strategies when you encounter parents with disabilities?
I would say the greatest challenge when I started working with one of these child protection family who was headed by a person with intellectual disability was that very first meeting, because often they've already been to court. Often the child's already in placement. They have a child protection worker they can't stand. They have in some cases, a prosecuting attorney who is going to do everything they can to take the child away. They didn't like the way the judge looked at them. Now there's this guardian ad litem who's going to be weighing in. And here I walk in. I'm from the same county, from the same system. My social work title has a different department and a different division, but that initial sense that, oh, here's another worker from the county. And so that initial sales job of this is who I am, this is what I can provide for you, or what I hope I can provide for you, and then just opening it up to them. What are your questions? What do you want to know? Many of them feel like they haven't had that opportunity. Nobody's wanted to hear from them. Everybody's already decided, and nobody wants to know what they think. And so I always kind of chuckled with little variation. The first question was always, well, you're going to help me with parenting? Are you a parent? Well, yeah, I am. Well, how old are your kids? And they'd want to know about me. Are you married? Well, does your wife just stay home with the kids all? No, my wife works. Well, what do you do with your kids? And so we would have those kind of discussions that would relate to me, away from my role as the social worker, and now my role in what happens the other 16 hours of the day. Where do you live? How long have you been doing this job? How old are your kids? Because I think there's this sense that, in walks the white guy, and oftentimes walking into a family of different ethnicity than me, that there's an assumption, and oftentimes they've dealt with a white judge, much less so, but certainly there's, the likelihood that they've dealt with people from a different ethnicity who they've already had bad experiences with, and now they have a person from that same ethnic group who they assume is going to look down the end of their nose at them. And here's another one. He looks a little older. He looks, but getting them to buy in quickly. Some of the common barriers are, I would say that access to resources in a timely manner,
as well as the length of time that the services are provided are two big barriers that I noticed when we were working with child protection. One, I would also subscribe that folks who work with this particular population need to actually have special training. So when I was the division manager, we are actually arranged to have what we call special needs child protection workers. So they were designated workers who only worked with clients who were developmental disabilities. They either had children who fit that criteria or they themselves fit that criteria as well. And so these folks had specialized training in terms of working with various types of disabilities. They had access to resources. They were paired with other parts of our division that work specifically with developmental disabilities. And we worked together with them under the construct of child welfare with those timeframes to look at what we could do to reunify families when at all possible. I think that there is a next level that's needed. And what we did primarily is we looked at the in our human services division in our particular county that I worked with at that time. There was a unit that worked with adults with developmental disabilities, as well as there was another unit that worked with children. And so what we did is we paired those particular workers with those particular workers from those other units to really talk about what their job entailed, to really look at what some of the diagnoses meant, how to access the resources, the services that they were eligible for. And then there were on other occasions where we actually had workers who themselves had children who had severe disabilities. So they then had an inside track in terms of recognizing what needed to happen to actually get services for their own children within our system. So the combination of that, and then as we had folks who would stay on in those particular positions, we would help them be responsible for the ongoing training for those other workers that were coming behind them. So the newer workers were being trained by the older workers, as well as workers from the other parts of the division that worked specifically with developmental disabilities. And we found that to be quite successful.
I do think that disability is a content area that probably does lack compared to other areas. But there are, especially having CASHU based in the University of Minnesota, there are a lot. In fact, just this week, there was a webinar conducted on parents with disabilities. And so that was a great overview. And there are many faculty in the institution that are dedicating their lives to, improving the outcomes for parents with disabilities. So I think just being able to be in that context where people are wanting to learn about that, it gives you a reason to want to learn about it too. So even if it's not in the texts that you're reading every day, you're not really going to think information is important until you're given an idea as to why it should be important. And I think they're really creating the environment to recognize the importance of disabled individuals and their kind of historic exclusion from social services.
The notion that I already walk in the door with the belief that they have some capacities and capabilities that others have already decided they don't, without giving them the benefit of the doubt. And so selling them on that notion that I believe in them, right out of the gate. I've only met them. And I always say to them, the only thing I know about you is what I've read. And boy, it doesn't look good. Those reports do not look very good for you. And so part of what I need to do, and you need to do with me, is that the court is going to want to report for me. And I want to be able to say to the court, on page 2, paragraph 3, it talks about, perfect example, I got a child protection report. And it said, Rebecca doesn't even know how to hold a baby. Okay. And that was something that the nurse had said, who called child protection. She doesn't even know how to hold a baby. Rebecca was 16 years old. And my immediate thought is not, well, Rebecca doesn't know how to hold a baby. It's like, well, did the nurse show her? she's in placement. She was able to go visit the child at the foster home. Ended up being a friend or an acquaintance of the family. Did the foster mom show her how to hold the baby? And what I ultimately found out was no. And as I talked more with her mother, she had 4 daughters, 3 who had no intellectual difficulties. Rebecca was the second oldest, and mom let everybody babysit for people in the neighborhood, but she wouldn't let Rebecca because she feared there was going to be a problem. So mom had never even taught her how to hold a baby. Sitting down with Rebecca and saying, this report says you don't even know how to hold a baby. So let's figure that out. Another thing that was in the report was she doesn't know how to swaddle a baby. Here, I'm a parenting worker. I didn't even know what the word swaddle meant. I had to go and look in a dictionary. Actually, I got on the phone and called my wife and I said, "What's swaddle?" She goes, "Oh, that's when you wrap the baby up really tight and you get them nice and snug and it's comforting for them." I said, "Oh," I I didn't know that was called swaddling. I mean, I knew that that's something we had always done with our children. And again, it was my question to their report was, did anybody show her how to swaddle a baby? And did anybody explain why you swaddle a baby? And so, that was part of that whole salesman kind of thing, convincing them that I want to be able to write a report for your next court hearing in 2 months. And I want to be able to say, I showed Rebecca how to hold a baby, and she has consistently held the baby the way babies are to be held. She has been able to show me her capability at burping. She's been able to show me that when her child is really struggling, she has 3 different strategies. She knows how to swaddle. She knows how to, give them examples of things, of what I have taught and what she can now show me she can do. One of the things that I discovered that I guess wasn't surprising is that there's not a lot that's taught to people that work in this field about how do you work with people with developmental disability. And again, I specifically worked with people who had IQs under 70. And the community that we live and work in is full of these folks. And so knowing and understanding this population is critical to being successful, because they're going to be on your caseload. I would say, so getting the knowledge, there's not a lot out there. You have to search to find knowledge. And I do think some of that process starts with your own attitudes and your own belief system and your understanding and willingness to be patient. This is a population that needs you to be more patient. This is a population that needs you to give them time. This is a population that needs you to explain things multiple times. And when you come back next week for a visit and they're still doing something that they were doing the previous visit, you accomplish nothing by scolding them for still doing something the way they were doing it. What you do is you talk about how, remember when last week you were doing such and such, and I said, it needs to be done this way. And what can I do to help you remember those? And so coming up with your own little strategies. I always wrote notes on Post-it notes for clients about certain things that I wanted them to review on a regular basis. Acknowledging that they are people who have abilities, who have capabilities. They may not be the same as us, but they have capacities that will surprise you if you allow them the opportunity to show you. But again, it requires patience. and it requires a willingness to maybe go beyond your own comfort level. It's not an easy population, but it is an incredibly rewarding population to work with. I think some of the other things that are really important is to use resources that are around you. You all have colleagues who have a case similar. You all have colleagues who have had both positive and less than positive experiences working with this population. You should be consulting with your colleagues and finding out what worked, what didn't work, what community resources. I'm amazed at how often I come into a situation and very simple resources are needed, and they should have already been in place by the time I show up as the parenting worker, and they're not there. And there's been times where I've said to the referring worker, they don't even know where the food shelf is in their neighborhood. Can't you? Why haven't you? And I try not to be too challenging, but challenge them on, this is part of your job at helping them understand the community resources, be it food shelves, be it the medical clinic that provides pediatric care that's in their neighborhood, faith communities. Maybe they're in a new neighborhood and they don't want to drive to South Minneapolis because now they're living in North Minneapolis, or they don't have money to get on a bus. Is there a faith community that will come and pick them up? My experience is that this population is very invested in their faith, and I don't know why, but they are almost always people that have participated in faith communities in their life. And now, just because they're in a new neighborhood, or now because they have children, isn't a reason to fall away from the faith community. It's a time to get even more engaged. And so helping these folks that you're working with learn and understand and know the resources.
Given the experiences you've heard from these child welfare professionals, reflect on your practice. As you listen to closing advice from professionals in the field, reflect on ways you can strengthen your ability to work with parents with disabilities.
I think the best advice that I can give anybody is just basic social work skills, and go back to what you learned. Meet your clients where they're at. Figure out what they're going through, talk to them, get on their level, see what it is that they want for help from you, and start there. I think if we work on building a relationship to start, figuring out what those needs are and what those strengths are, I think that's the best way to be successful as a social worker and to help your client be successful long term.
I think the most important thing that a child protection worker needs to know in working with a parent with a disability is that every parent is unique and that abilities vary greatly, and that each person has to be taken on their own merits. I think it's critical that workers understand parents can learn, they can change and develop skills and knowledge like anybody else, and that the children of people with disabilities love their parents and their families and want to be with their parents and their families like any other kid. I think that sometimes the bias that society brings to these cases and that workers bring to these cases is that thought of, but what about the kids? Like, there's an inherent disadvantage to being a kid of a parent with a disability, that they might get less of something in some way, or that their life, the quality of their life might be less in some way. And that often when you talk to kids who were raised by parents, whether it's a mental illness or a developmental disability or a physical disability, acquired disability, maybe through war as a veteran, Those children love their parents, period. They want to be with their family, period. They don't see the disability the way that society sees the disability. They see their parent whom they love. Now, does that family function differently? Yep. Does that kid maybe do things differently than kids in another family do? Yep. Could those kids be teased or harassed by other kids or other people in their world? Yeah, but it also allows them the ability to develop empathy, strength, insight in ways that will serve them as adults and is helpful and beneficial to their development. It's not a deficit to be a kid of a parent with a disability. You can make the most out of it, and you need to support kids to do that.
I would say the biggest weapon in the arsenal is that of education. It's really about helping folks really understand what it means to be disabled or what it means to be intellectually impaired. And to really help folks understand that as social workers, we are bound by a set of ethical principles that say that we advocate and we provide services for all people. Our entire mission is around that of social justice and raising the level of equality and to raise the level of and quality of life for everyone, regardless of where they come from or what they bring. So I really think it's about getting back to those core social work values and reminding people that that's the job, that's what we do. And no matter who we encounter or who we come across, that's the expectation. And there's no place really for discrimination in the work that we do with the families that we serve.
This concludes the end of this module. Additional resources regarding information covered in this module can be found on the Disability Child Welfare Collaborative page within the CASHU website. Thank you all for watching.